Stalin was the last effective leader the Soviet Union really had. Nikita Khrushchev, who came to power in 1958, 5 years after Stalin died, only lasted 6 years as the sole leader of Russia. Khrushchev hated Stalin and tried to remove a lot of Stalin's influence on the Soviet Union, especially the culture of terror Stalin had created decades earlier with its purges. Khrushchev felt that Stalin had steered Russia away from socialism, and Khrushchev wanted to get Russia back on track. He tried to pursue a more peaceful and cooperative expansion of the Soviet Union and communism, but pressure inside and outside of the USSR's borders undermined his efforts. Since most people in the Communist Party and in the USSR's government got those positions because Stalin put them there, they naturally remained loyal to Stalin and his vision of what the USSR should be. When Khrushchev seemed bent on changing the direction of the Soviet Union, he met opposition from many former Stalinists, especially when he wanted to present a less aggressive, more diplomatic face to the world. Militant, hardliner Stalinists would have no tolerance for such behavior. When Khrushchev failed to put nuclear weapons in Cuba, after he backed down from the U.S. blockade of that nation during the Cuban Missile Crisis, his peers in the government had had enough and removed him from power less than 2 years later. The next Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, was more like Stalin than Khrushchev, and as such, he threw the USSR and its relationship with the West back to the more aggressive, militant, and oppositional relationship it had once known. Brezhnev ruled the USSR with an iron fist and an active secret police, known as the KGB, for 18 years, from 1964 through 1982. In that time, the USSR engaged in a dramatic, rapid buildup of both its conventional army, which would be the largest on Earth by 1975, and its nuclear weapons stockpile, which overtook the USA's by the late 1960s, making the USSR the world's largest producer of nuclear weapons ever since. Brezhnev also got the Soviet Union engaged in a brutal and bloody long war with Afghanistan, which began in 1979 and wouldn't end until many years after his death in 1987. Many historians refer to the USSR-Afghan War as Russia's Vietnam, because even though the USSR had vastly superior firepower and their weaponry was far more advanced than the relatively primitive Afghans, the Afghan style of guerrilla warfare plus secret aid and weapons supplied by the US allowed the supposedly weaker Afghan people to not only avoid defeat, but to draw out the war to over 8 years in length and cost Russia untold hundreds of billions of dollars and tens of thousands of lives to fight. By the time Brezhnev died in 1982, Russia was spending half of all of the money it made solely on supporting its military. He made no social reforms of note and had done next to nothing to make living in the USSR any better. But it did have the most dominating military power in the world. After Brezhnev's death, Russia quickly saw 2 more Soviet premiers come and go. Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko both died after spending less than a year in office. As such, they did little to change the USSR, nor help in finding ways for it to earn money to not only fund its increasingly expensive military, but also to develop the products and reforms that Russians had wanted. The US president at the time, Ronald Reagan, only made things more difficult for the Soviet Union and its poor leadership by taking a very hardline stance against communism. Reagan announced early in his first term in office in the early 1980s the U.S. intent to create an outer space missile shield, which was nicknamed Star Wars after the popular science fiction movie at the time, in which satellites equipped with lasers and anti-missile rockets would be able to shoot down any nuclear missiles the Russians launched, effectively disarming them. And never mind that even today that technology doesn't exist and probably won't exist throughout the near future, the Russians were still scared and getting desperate. Reagan openly referred to the USSR as the evil empire, again in reference to the popular Star Wars trilogy. Remember, Reagan used to be an actor. He loved making references to Hollywood. He also challenged the USSR to tear down the Berlin Wall and prove its peaceful intentions toward the West.
Ronald Reagan has never been to the Soviet bloc, but today he stood within yards of it. At his back, the Berlin Wall, a scar he called it, and the Brandenburg Gate. Mr. Reagan had come with a message.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Reagan was beating the USSR up in the press during the 1980s and had made Russians sufficiently fearful of what a rejuvenated and re-energized US could do to Russia. In many ways, Mikhail Gorbachev would be the man, the leader that Russians had wanted, if not needed. When Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he immediately began scaling back Russia's military expenditures to save his country some money. He de-escalated its nuclear weapons production and slowly began withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. While such measures were appreciated by Russians and Americans alike, he wasn't making the USSR look any stronger in the eyes of its foe, the American government. Gorbachev knew that the USSR could not continue to exist unless some fundamental changes were introduced to his country, and so he created 3 reforms. He didn't know it at the time, but these 3 changes would ultimately dismantle communism and the USSR itself. The first was known as glasnost, which is Russian for openness. Through glasnost, he removed a great deal of the censorship the Soviet Union had once placed upon artists in the press. Artists were much freer to paint and sing and write as they liked, without needing the government's approval, without fearing the government's disapproval. For the first time in nearly 7 decades, the Russian press was not only free to report unedited versions of news stories, they could even criticize government. Glasnost allowed for more open and honest discussions about the USSR and its policies. The next reform was Perestroika. Under Soviet rule, people were actually allowed to own their own business and earn profit from it. They just couldn't employ anyone but themselves. Employing a worker was akin to exploiting him for his labor. So as a result, what Russian private businesses existed under the USSR were usually very small and individually run. Under Perestroika, private ownership of business dramatically expanded, allowing people to not only run their own business, but hire other workers. The government removed its quotas and mandates over production and allowed free enterprise to determine what Russian industry would produce. As a result, more and more consumer goods became available to Russians by the end of the 1980s. The last reform was demokratizatsiya, or democratization. Gorbachev allowed other political parties besides the Communist Party to exist and run for public office. Demokratizatsiya allowed for competition in the Communist Party to exist. It allowed people and parties who had different visions and aims for Russia to pitch these to the voting public. Gorbachev had hoped that with these reforms, glasnost, perestroika, and demokratizatsiya, the USSR could peacefully and prosperously return to its pursuit of creating a classless society through socialism. But the best-laid plans of mice and men oft go awry. The rapid influence of Western culture under glasnost and perestroika, the removal of censorship and imprisonment for expressing one's mind, and the expansion of democracy led to widespread protests and demonstrations throughout both Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union by the late 1980s, and a demand for the end of communist Russia. In 1991, a coup led by leader Boris Yeltsin and joined in by tens of thousands of political dissidents ranging from angry mothers and grandmothers who had seen their sons and grandsons disappeared by Stalin and Brezhnev, to army veterans upset over their treatment during and after the Afghan War, had arrested and imprisoned Gorbachev in a dacha, a sort of summer home located along the Crimean border. When he was freed later that year, Gorbachev had found that neither the Russian government nor its people were loyal to him. They had been swayed to support the democratic and anti-totalitarian, anti-socialist leanings of Boris Yeltsin. That year, Gorbachev stepped down from leadership of the USSR, and with him, the Soviet Union had come to an end. Boris Yeltsin was the first president ever democratically elected in Russia that year, and the Russian Federation was born. A nation who in the 1990s would for the first time in its history experiment both with democracy and with capitalism. The United States had won the Cold War, not by destroying the Russians in the field of battle, but by first bankrupting them and then allowing them to transform into a sort of Russian version of America, a nation that embraced both democracy and free enterprise. The Russians lost the Cold War by becoming like the U.S. The competition between socialism and capitalism, between democracy and totalitarianism, was over. But what the future held for Russia, a nation which had until recently been second only to the United States in wealth, and even more powerful militarily, was anybody's guess.